This video will walk you through how to respond to the 2023 argument prompt for the AP English Language exam, which was a Carlos Curbelo quote. He was a congressman in 2018. The prompt tells you that. And he said, if you're trying to convince someone that they need to get involved in an issue or perhaps change their thinking on an issue, trying to scare them is not always effective and can actually sow resentment. So that is on the 2023 argument prompt. Students see that. Then they also see underneath that, write an essay that argues your position on the extent to which Curbelo's claim about persuading others is valid. Now, they help us here in that they tell us Curbelo's claim is about persuading others. It doesn't tell us what he's saying about persuading others, but I think that it's fairly easy quote to figure out here in that he is saying that if we use fear to persuade others, then we could actually have that backfire on us and people end up resenting us because we use that fear. I think it's a very apt quote in 2024 when we think of politics and just everything seems to be an argument and there's so much fear mongering going on. So it's a very good quote. Students should note that it's always going to be an obscure quote. It might not be an obscure person like Representative Carlos Curbelo. I had never heard of him. I would think that just about anybody outside of his district had probably never heard of him. But the quote will always be obscure. You are not going to get "be the change you want to see in the world" from Gandhi. That is not going to be a quote. They are going to put a quote on this exam that nobody has seen before so that there's an even playing field, a level playing field throughout the country as students take this. So what do you have to do to write the introduction for this prompt? Well, for any prompt. First, do you agree or disagree with the statement? And then second, to what extent do you agree or disagree? Those are the two questions that you have to answer before you can write the introduction. So I've decided that I will agree with Curbelo. I do not think that fear is a good motivator. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to write the quote. I'm going to say Carlos Curbelo stated, and I'm going to write the whole quote out. As long as the quote, and they are usually pithy, they're usually short like this. As long as the quote is short, then I recommend writing the whole quote out. The second thing I'm going to do is interpret the quote. And my interpretation of the quote in the argument exam is essential. I can't misinterpret the quote. If I do that, I'm setting myself up for a 1 or a 2 on the essay because my entire body will then be off. And then third, I'm going to state my position, but I'm going to use a subordinate conjunction to ensure that I have a defensible thesis. So my 4 favorite subordinate conjunctions, there are many, but I like because, although, if, and when. And I feel like if you know those 4, you can get a lot of complexity into the big sentences, the thesis statement, and the topic sentences in your paper. So here's what the introduction ends up looking like. You've got the quote first, and then there's my interpretation. In this day and age of 24 hours news cycles, fear is often used as a way to get people to react. Commercials use fear, politicians use fear, and because people are afraid, they might be more willing to do whatever the news, commercial, or politician wants them to do. However, is fear the best motivator? Can we really get what we want long-term through the use of fear? I contend that we cannot. So then I come in with my position. I contend that we cannot. So I am agreeing with Curbelo, and then I use a subordinate conjunction because fear is an emotion that people can overcome with facts and time. It is not a good way to persuade others that an idea is valid. The interpretation that talked about commercials and politicians, that actually will lead into my body. And I think that the introduction could lead you to the ideas in the body. The ideas that you come up with for the body could end up writing your introduction. In my case, I just started writing this essay. I didn't think of my textual evidence ahead of time because I was very confident that when it came time to think of textual evidence, I would think of plenty. So I wrote the introduction cold, and I feel like the introduction gave me the ideas, the text for a textual evidence in the body that I'll end up using, because it is commercials and it is not politicians but politics. So how do we come up with our textual evidence? If we're stuck and we need to think of specific textual evidence, my favorite acronym, there are many that teachers will teach, but the one that I like is CHORES. And in CHORES, the C stands for current events, the H stands for history, O is our experiences, we're kind of cheating there, R is readings, E is entertainment, and the S stands for sports and science. So you can go to anything that's happening today, anything that happened in the past, anything that's personal, anything that you've read and that does not just have to be a book. Entertainment equals video games and movies and television and streaming, and sports and science, of course, sports, athletics, right? And then science, anything from biology, chemistry, physics. So the key here, though, is to be as specific as possible. So if I were going to use something from the American Revolution, let's say I'm going to use history textual evidence, and I'm going to use the American Revolution, can I get more specific than the American Revolution? Maybe I'm only going to talk about the Boston Tea Party, or maybe I'm only going to talk about the Boston Massacre, or maybe I'm going to talk about a specific battle in the American Revolution. Then can I get more specific and narrow it down to that level of textual evidence? So what I ended up using was a commercial that I recently saw for Bayer aspirin, and then the misinformation campaign against vaccines. So that is what I will use as my textual support, about fear not being a valid motivator. So my 2023 argument body paragraph, I'm of course not going to read this to you, but in the topic sentence is italicized. And then I come in with quite a bit of textual evidence, and I'm explaining why Bayer aspirin equals textual evidence for this particular prompt. And then I have one line of analysis, which is underlined, and then bolded again is more textual evidence. I talk about the podcaster Joe Rogan, who says vaccines don't work, and I talk about some news stations that say vaccines don't work, this misinformation against vaccines and COVID and spreading government conspiracies. And then I have a huge chunk of analysis of that textual evidence. So you can read through all of that. Of course, I'm, with the argument essay, everything that is textual evidence is coming out of my head. The exam has not given me any of this information, so I have to know that Joe Rogan is not against, but doesn't believe in vaccines. I have to know that Sean Hannity is somebody who has spoken out against vaccines. I have to know that 86,000 people died in Florida, more than the rest of the country, because of the poor conversation around COVID and around vaccines. So I have to know all of that ahead of time. So again, if you use the CHORES acronym, then you might be able to come up with something that you know about, even though you might not know about Bayer aspirin, and even though you might not know about the misinformation campaign against vaccines, you would come up with your own textual evidence that, of course, you do know about. So this is the picture of the congressman. I thought that would make a good conclusion to this video. But the structure of the paragraph that we just went over, the first sentence mentioned the quote. That was my topic sentence. My second sentence cited some textual evidence, and then I had to describe the textual evidence because it wasn't common textual evidence, the Bayer aspirin, right? So that's a step that sometimes you can skip and sometimes you can't. You have to know how obvious your textual evidence is to other people. Then I get textual evidence is used to support Corbello, and I use mostly logic to piece together my argument. The pieces, I think, get put together almost like a puzzle, so that one sentence must lead to the next, must lead to the next, must lead to the next. And then, because the paragraph wasn't long enough when I got done with Bayer aspirin, I introduce the second piece of textual evidence, the misinformation against vaccines, at sentence 7, and then I analyze that. So you would want to have at least an introduction, 2 body paragraphs, and a conclusion in your argument. So you've only seen an introduction and 1 body paragraph in this video, but you would want to write at least 2 body paragraphs. That way your textual evidence and your analysis isn't all getting dumped into 1 paragraph and remaining general. I feel like if you have at least 2 body paragraphs, 3 is not a magic number, but I think 2 or more, you're automatically going to start organizing your textual evidence, because some of it has to go in paragraph 1 and some of it has to go in paragraph 2. And I just think that you automatically get more specific, and being more specific in this FRQ is the key to success. So hopefully this makes sense and you will write a better argument FRQ as a result of this video. I think that the 2023 prompt was very fair, and I would imagine that it scored fairly high.